Welcome to the Wisdom of the Body podcast. I'm your host, Heather Grzych. Here, we talk about the profound connection between mind, body, and spirit. Join me and other authors, wellness experts, and everyday individuals talk about the importance of listening to our bodies, trusting our guts, and living in deeper harmony with nature. So, whether you're seeking guidance on your wellness journey or simply looking for inspiration, you're in the right place. We're thrilled to be in the top 3% of podcasts globally. You can find the Wisdom of the Body podcast on Apple, Spotify, and most other places where people listen to podcasts. You can follow by joining my email list at heathergrzych.com or by following me on Instagram at Heather Grzych. That's Heather, Grzych. I know you're going to love this podcast, so take a second right now to subscribe. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Wisdom of the Body. Today we're going to talk about the tragic history of a symbol that is extremely complicated, the swastika. I was born in the United States, and for me, the swastika has always represented one thing: hatred, killing, oppression, genocide. My son is from a Jewish lineage. Some of his ancestors were killed in concentration camps. That's a history that is not abstract. It's part of our family story, memory, and reality. So when I first saw the swastika used in Indian spiritual practice on altars, in rituals, and even in artwork, I was really shocked. No, I was horrified. And I had no clue that long before the Nazis co-opted this symbol, it was a symbol that represented something else to a totally different group of people. It was a symbol that represented sacredness and well-being in a totally different culture. How could a symbol that means one really positive and healthy thing for one culture be so violent, so painful for others? And then it struck me, this is a perfect example of how the meaning of symbols and words and objects change over time across cultures. Something that represents life and prosperity in one context can carry terror and trauma in another. The swastika in Sanskrit, it's an ancient symbol. I'm told that it translates roughly to that which is auspicious or well-being. It's been used for thousands of years in Indian culture in religious and ritual contexts. It's drawn on temple walls, in mandalas, or on ceremonial items, and sometimes it's placed at the threshold of homes to mark auspicious beginnings. So in Hinduism, in Buddhism, and in Jainism, the swastika is sometimes used as a sacred symbol. And its orientation, it depends based on the specific tradition and region. I'm familiar with a similar Sanskrit word because I studied Ayurvedic medicine. And when we're in school to study Ayurvedic medicine, we have to learn Sanskrit because all of the disease names, all of the qualities of health and disease, and all of the substances that we use in the therapies are all taught to us with their Sanskrit names. So there's a similar word called swasta. And this is actually the goal of Ayurveda, which means health, roughly. The more literal translation is established in one's own self. Swasta, established in one's own self. So while the words are related, swastika is a cultural symbol of auspiciousness, and swasta is a clinical and philosophical term that is central to the practice of Ayurveda, which is a form of traditional Indian medicine. But what happened was, in the 20th century, that symbol, the swastika, was hijacked by the Nazi Party in Germany. The Nazis took this ancient emblem and they used it as their official logo. They made it a symbol of their political ideology, and it got tied to hatred, racial oppression, and genocide. And because of this appropriation of this symbol, the swastika became, for much of the world, including where I live, a symbol of terror rather than auspiciousness. And it became banned in many countries. And if you see it today, you get a visceral response. So, my personal reaction to seeing a swastika used in an Indian spiritual context, and I imagine the reaction of many Western listeners or anybody who sees it in used in any spiritual context, that my reaction was very visceral. And growing up with this history, with the memory of families like my son's, dad's um, lineage, these people who suffered and died under that symbol is extremely jarring, considering so many people have suffered underneath the spell of that symbol. And it's so weird because think about it. Imagine if a company or a country took the smiley face emoticon and made it their logo. And suddenly they took out a horrific act of terror across the globe or a specific population. And overnight, basically, that emoticon, that little smiley face emoticon, would which is linked with happiness and joy and positive things, that would be forever linked in our minds with violence and loss. So apparently that's what happened to the swastika. The symbol that was once meaning well-being and auspiciousness became, for much of the world, this symbol of terror and genocide. So even though the symbol is sacred and auspicious in its original context, outside of that cultural frame, it can trigger a cascade of emotions, really negative ones: fear, confusion, and anger. If you would even think about using that symbol today, you would incite a very strong negative reaction, even if you meant to use it according to its pre-Nazi meaning. So it's a really strong real world example of how symbols, when we have a symbol, the meaning of a symbol is not fixed. It can change. And why awareness of symbols and their history is really, really, really important. And the context in which we use them is very important. Sadly, a friend, an Indian American friend of mine, I asked recently, I said, hey, tell me about how Indian families and Hindu families and are using or have used historically the swastika. What does it mean to people? And this friend shared with me that the symbol's sacred meaning in Hindu and Jain cultures is used for harmonizing energy very, very privately today. So it's to them, it's extremely tragic that this symbol that had such a positive meaning for them was associated with the Nazi regime. It's like extremely unfair to them. They feel really super um, conflicted about it because they will use it in their homes still very privately, but it's never shared in public due to those historical associations with the Nazi regime. And it's really sad that they feel that they actually have to hide it. So, this symbol that in their culture means something really positive, they might be displaying it in their home or they might be tracing it somewhere, invisibly with their hand to bless something, to invoke something. And if someone were to come to their house who was not Hindu, they would want to hide it. And, to anybody who doesn't know those pre Nazi uses or doesn't appreciate those pre-Nazi uses. So it's really sad that, a lot of the Hindus still want to use that image, and they have to hide it even though it inspires them and has a completely different meaning. So this is, again, just a very powerful reminder of the fact that symbols don't have fixed meanings. They shift over time, they shift across geographies and between communities. And the same thing happens with words. So let's take the word yoga, for example. I just went to a yoga retreat center recently with a friend, and she's not really into yoga, but I've been teaching for a long time, and it was really cute. She said I was nice to the yoga teachers because even though I was better than them at yoga, I was really humble and didn't make it like I listened to all of their cues or whatever, which I thought was funny. And I found myself explaining the meaning of the word yoga because we in the West have misinterpreted the word yoga, apparently. So the word yoga, as I was taught from my yoga teachers, is literally the Sanskrit word is yoga. It comes from this root word yuj, which the meaning means to yoke or union, to yoke together or union. It doesn't mean, doing a headstand, or it doesn't mean doing a downward dog. Historically, the word yoga refers to the idea of bringing things together, whether that's the mind and the body, or the individual consciousness with the universal consciousness, or people and their environment. It's just the idea of bringing things together. But over time, especially in Western culture, yoga has become associated primarily with the physical postures associated with the practice of yoga asana. So, physical postures, the word for that is asana. And you might notice when you take a yoga class that they call the cobra pose bhujangasana, or downward facing dog is adho mukha svanasana, or that final resting pose is shavasana. So everything ends in asana because it's some type of asana, some type of pose. So the word that we have in our mind, yoga, and then it's associated with this idea of doing a series of physical movements, is actually not the same meaning that a bunch of other people have for that word. And that's actually a very uh, frustrating thing for a lot of people that came from Indian culture to know that that was misinterpreted. But that's what happens with words as they cross different cultures and borders, and it makes me wonder, what symbols from the cultures of my birth. The cultures of my birth are American. I was born in New England. I was born in a very heavily Italian American town, so therefore everybody was Catholic. Tons of Catholic people that live there. What symbols from that culture that I grew up in, I'm curious, like, have they been used with different meanings in other cultures? So if any of you listeners are thinking of some of those, I would actually really love to hear about that. I mean, I think I was thinking a lot of different religious imagery from Catholicism, and the potential there for different symbols to be misused. And I think this is related to something I experienced a few years ago, where there seemed to be this big push to not use the word woman in the English language. And I had friends and colleagues, and even a company that I wrote an article for, telling me that I could not use the word woman in an article I was writing about women's health. Now, I wrote a fertility book, so I often write about women's health. And I suppose more technically, I'm writing about female health because I'm oftentimes writing about biological female health. But even using that word female was not cool for some people. And I don't know exactly where that push was coming from in our culture, but I was told that saying the word woman and even using female anatomical terms can be so triggering for some people, such as, like, people who are interested in having a different gender, or have believe they are a different gender, or have experienced some physical or psychological trauma related to their biological sex, that there was this big push to use different words to mean the same thing and to not trigger people. I was told I should say something like people with ovaries or people with uteruses, rather than the word woman. And I can't say that I've really adopted that because it's very wordy and kludgy for me to do so. And yeah, so for me, but there are a lot of people that have adopted that way of speaking, especially people who are dealing with populations and interacting a lot with populations where there are a lot of people with gender, alternative gender things going on. So, yeah, it's just sad, right? How words can become charged just because their meaning means different things to different people. Symbols, words, objects, they can mean different things to different people. So it's important to clarify for the listeners that in my Ayurvedic practice, I'm never going to use the swastika. I'm not going to put it places. I'm not going to put it in my office. I know what it means to most people I'm around on a day-to-day basis. And it doesn't have that meaning to me. It has the same meaning, it doesn't have the same meaning to me that it has to somebody from the Hindu culture or a Jain culture that might be processing it differently. And yeah, so I'm not interested in using symbols that carry historical trauma, but I understand why someone else might want to and the challenges associated with doing so. Acknowledging sacred traditions of India, it doesn't mean ignoring the pain that the symbol carries in the West, right? So this is a universal challenge of responsible translation, thoughtful communication, and ethical engagement with different cultural practices. And in a world as global as we have, this is not just a challenge of, India's rich treasures spreading across the globe. It's also a challenge of any culture that's crossing a border and taking on new life somewhere else. Maybe also in knowing that a symbol may have had a different meaning somewhere else, maybe we as individuals can soften to hear the intention of why a person might use a symbol. Or, I don't know, are we stuck? Will our minds remain fixed on that meaning that's been branded into us? I really honestly don't know the answer to that, but I like asking that question. Can a symbol like the swastika or words like yoga be healed when their meanings collide across different cultures and borders? I think it's a normal phenomenon for the meaning of a word or a symbol to change over time. Just like the fluid in a body, when it crosses over a membrane, it often undergoes a change in its properties on the other side of that membrane. So, just like that, symbols and words shift as they move through different cultures and different histories and different contexts. If you research the origins of words from the ancient languages like Greek and Roman and Sanskrit to the modern ones that we speak today, you can see that it's more natural for words and meaning to change over time than to remain fixed. I'm not a language expert, okay? Let me put that out there. I studied Ayurvedic medicine. I am not a language expert. I am a writer. That's why I find this interesting. I did not study linguistics. I think somebody who studied linguistics could probably be a super interesting person to talk with about this. It's fascinating, though. As a writer, it's fascinating to think about the meanings of words. And when you choose as a writer to use a word or in conversation to use a specific word with somebody. And a few years ago, I read this sci-fi book that, in its imagined world, the author had switched the meanings of common words. Love, for example, instead of meaning love, love meant money, and money meant love in this book, in this world. So love meant money, and money meant love. They were swapped. There were a few other words that were swapped like this in the book. Reading this, where it was very disorienting at first, and then your mind sort of gets the uses down, it gets the lingo down, it gets the meaning in this world, in this context. And it perfectly illustrates how meaning can be fluid and how it depends on context and how it can be deliberately or unconsciously transformed over time. Yet when we're not aware of the triggering words and symbols, we can have a powerful emotional response to those symbols. And some symbols are like landmines. They carry all kinds of trauma, cultural memory that can be activated before we even consciously recognize them. Changing, how people understand symbols, whether that's restoring a previous meaning or creating a new shared meaning in the future. That takes time. That happens over time. That happens, I think, consistent communication, awareness. It's not an easy thing to do. I think healing a symbol or a word is never going to be instantaneous. It's going to be gradual. It's going to be deliberate, and require really careful attention to the context and the history and the audience and the emotional weight that symbols carry. But in the meantime, maybe we just do the best we can to communicate with each other using symbols and words that are relevant now, and remain aware of the histories, the emotional weight that they carry. And even if meanings shift or misfire or trigger unexpected reactions, our care and our attention in communication matter. I don't know if symbols can be healed, but I think people can understand why they might want to use them, why they might feel they're inspiring, why they might find them hurtful through education, dialogue. When we as individual people tell our stories, and not by ignoring history, but by being open about it, providing the context necessary for people to understand each other, as in any kind of sharing situation between two people really listening to each other. Because symbols and words and objects are mirrors, and they reflect our culture, they reflect our intentions and our consciousness. And some words carry wisdom, some words carry trauma, and some carry both. And maybe there's a place that we could get to where multiple truths can exist, that a word can mean one thing to one person and another thing to another person. So this week, maybe notice the symbols around you. Observe how they make you feel. And remember that understanding, even when it's very uncomfortable, that alone is incredibly healing in and of itself. Thank you for tuning in and dropping in with us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. I really want to hear your feedback. To learn more about my work, visit heathergrzych.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. And meet me here next time on The Wisdom of the Body.